In 1951, 1 year before Thurgood Marshall filed the brief that would bring the issue of segregation before the Supreme Court, he was dispatched to Korea by the NAACP to investigate the disproportionate number of black soldiers being court-martialed. This took place during the Korean War, which is usually thought of as taking place between 1950 and 1953, the first U.S. military conflict in which black soldiers fought side by side with white soldiers. Japanese American soldiers were also integrated into combat units during this conflict, many of whom had spent the prior war in internment camps. As even these bare facts suggest, the Korean War marked a watershed moment in the domestic history of race. It also inaugurated a wholesale transformation in racial conceptions of Asia. 5 years after a conflict in which Japan was vilified in openly racist terms, came one in which it was trumpeted as the most important Asian ally of the United States, and the heroism of Japanese American soldiers were celebrated. China, formerly an ally, became the most imposing enemy that U.S. forces would face in Korea, and Koreans, few Americans knew anything about them, mainly that some apparently yearned for freedom while others had fallen under the sway of communism. In fact, North and South Korea were two of the many non-white nations that emerged out of the shadow of empire in the wake of World War II. The Korean War was thus not simply the first hot war of the Cold War, but also a civil conflict between two nascent post-colonial nation states. To most Americans, however, this conflict is known simply as the Forgotten War. The book I'm writing aims to help remedy this forgetting by offering a robust and multifaceted account of the pivotal role that this event played in both the domestic and transnational history of race. It's an interdisciplinary study that weaves together literary and film criticism, history, and theoretical work on cultural memory. One of its aims is to offer a cultural history of the 1950s, returning us to the movies and the journalism produced during the Korean War and in the decade after. These depictions make clear how suitable the theater of war was for staging dramas of interracial and transnational intimacy between U.S. soldiers of different races and between U.S. military men and Asian civilians. Part one of the book is comprised of 4 chapters, and it looks mainly at Hollywood films and the press coverage, and I also look at the black press and the Japanese American press. Part 2 of the study is a literary critical project, and I look at a number of novels that have come out in the past 15, 20 years by African American. Toni Morrison has a novel called Howe, which is about the Korean War. Chang Rae Lee, Susan Choi, who are Korean American authors, and Ha Jin, who's a Chinese American author. I also have a chapter about Rolanda Hinojosa, who's a Mexican American writer, and one chapter on a South Korean writer named Hwang Suk Young. The approach I take in this book pivots around the concept of intimacy, which takes shape through 2 overlapping methodologies. In historiographical terms, I'm interested in the complex interplay between domestic histories of race in Cold War America and the multiple colonial trajectories that converged in the Korean War. This approach is akin to the one that Lisa Lowe has argued for in her book, The Intimacies of 4 Continents. As a work of literary and cultural criticism, this book also comes at the concept of intimacy from another angle, one that foregrounds issues of affect and ethics. So in part 2, these contemporary works I look at part 2 offer a darker vision of interracial and transnational connection. In their renderings of the affective intimacies that emerge through the brutality of war and out of its lingering aftermath, these works reimagine community in ways that exceed conventional notions of racial or ethnic identity. So what I'd like to do today is share with you some material that's mostly from my second chapter. I'm going to talk about the some of the coverage in the African American press, one film called All the Young Men, and that's. I'm going to try to squeeze in a third, so we'll see how the time goes. So part 1, Intimacies in Black and White, Military Multiculturalism in the Black Press, and All the Young Men. For the most part, while black newspapers refrain from outright jingoism, they generally voice no consistent opposition to President Truman's decision to send U.S. troops to Korea. This was due in part to the fact that Truman had issued Executive Order 9981 on July 26, 1948, which mandated that U.S. combat units be integrated, quote, as rapidly as possible, end quote. By the time that U.S. forces entered the fighting in Korea 2 years later, this order had yet to be implemented in any significant way, so the most explicit criticisms mounted in the black press were about an army whose commitment to desegregation was uneven at best, and basically most of the focus was on the performance of black soldiers and on the army being slow to integrate, and this treatment of the war in the black press has been studied by Daniel Widener and Penny von Eschen at the end of her book, Race Against Empire. And there's a stark turnaround between the coverage of the war in Korea and the coverage of the war in these same newspapers during World War II. In World War II, there was an anti-colonial formation that emerged among black political leaders and intellectuals and journalists, which sort of yoked the issue of domestic racism to colonialism. And that's the topic of Penny von Eschen's book. And so what the Korean War years saw was the collapse of this radical black anti-colonial formation. And according to Daniel Widener, the Korean War provided the impetus for a specific reordering of American race relations, paving the way for the emergence of the belief that the U.S. military, the primary purveyors of organized violence on the planet today, somehow represents the most meritocratic, socially equal, and ultimately progressive institution in American society. And Widener's building on the work of Melanie McAllister, who coins the term military multiculturalism, to talk about this ideology. So in the black press, and including in like the Atlanta Daily World is one of the papers I look at, you saw in the early years celebratory accounts of the 24th Regiment, which was an all-black regiment, and then over the course of the year you had images like this which sort of trumpeted the virtues of an integrated military. Some of the flavor of this reporting can be captured by a series that sorry, I lost my place, that James L. Hicks wrote for the Atlanta Daily World, where he visited a number of military bases in the U.S. in the summer of 1951, and he talked about the ones that were lagging behind in terms of integration, and then celebrated Camp Kilmer, and this is the sort of fulsome praise that he offers for Camp Kilmer. The small saplings of integration which the U.S. Army planted at Camp Kilmer some time ago have today grown into a forest of tall trees with deep roots whose branches reach out and cover the entire camp with a blanket of democracy. So in this war, the black press largely sort of participated in the war effort by sort of trumpeting the multiculturalism of the armed forces. And this was pretty much in line with what you saw in Hollywood movies. These are 3 Hollywood movies about the war. Steel Helmet came out in 1951, Battle Hymn came out in 1957, and Pork Chop Hill came out in 1959. Now you notice all 3 movies have white male leads. They also had this actor in a supporting part. Does anybody recognize this face? Okay, this is James Edwards, who was kind of Sidney Poitier before Sidney Poitier. And the Korean War actually was a boon for his career. He's in like every Korean War film. He's in The Manchurian Candidate, and he plays the same character. He's like the loyal, heroic black GI. And his career got forgotten along with the Korean War. But I think there's an interesting project in looking at his history. The film I want to talk about today is All the Young Men, which came out in 1960, and it was Sidney Poitier is the lead, and this is the Italian poster. I just like the poster, so I put it up there. But as you can see, Poitier gets co-lead billing along with Alan Ladd. So this is a pretty stark departure. You've got a black lead actor and a white lead actor headlining this film. And this film is also notable because the issue of military integration, which is a kind of subplot in other films, becomes the sort of focus of this one. This came out like 7 years before Guess Who's Coming to Dinner and The Heat of the Night, which were the films that really catapulted Poitier to fame and also made his name synonymous with liberal Hollywood films about race. The plot of All the Young Men is fairly standard. It focuses, I saw a lot of really bad war films in the process of this, and so you get a sense of the cliches pretty quickly. It focuses on a diverse unit of U.S. Marines who battle their way to a farmhouse overlooking a mountain pass where they're there to set up a crucial observation post. The men soon find themselves surrounded and outnumbered by hordes of communist soldiers. It culminates in a heroic last stand that both Poitier's Towler and Ladd's Kincaid survive. Its dramatic focus is on the tension and then the sense of brotherhood that emerges within the unit as a whole, but particularly between its 2 leads. The shifting dynamic between Poitier's and Ladd's characters, a tense interracial rivalry that's ultimately transformed into intimacy, is a familiar one. I mean, it's basically a buddy film at the center of this war film. And the tension between the 2 lead characters comes to the fore in the very first scene. The lieutenant who leads the unit is killed, and his dying act is to turn command over to Towler, which is Poitier's character. And Towler is it's kind of a parable for affirmative action, too, because Towler is the new black soldier who's been added to this unit. Alan Ladd's character is the grizzled veteran who the other men sort of see as their leader. So the central tension in the film is whether Poitier's character is going to be able to step up to the role that's been handed to him, and whether the men in the unit, who are all white except for one Native American character, whether they'll accept his command. So not to give anything away, but Sidney Poitier is successful. And I'm going to show you, and so it ends with, okay, so this is how the film ends. As the requisite horde of enemy troops descends upon the farmhouse in the film's final scene, he confidently barks orders. This is Towler. He confidently barks orders that are duly followed. He tells his men to seek safety in the surrounding woods and to take with them the Korean civilians that have been living in the house. He carries the injured Kincaid into a foxhole, and they prepare to make their heroic last stand. So this is the very ending of the movie. Towler is injured. So I'm going to play this clip, but yeah, I'll just play this clip. This is the end of the movie. Oh, no. Oh. I think it might be the only film in which you see Sidney Poitier shooting machine gun, which is like pretty awesome. Okay, so that's the ending of the film. Like a couple things I want to point out. The Saints Go Marching In comes up at the end, right? But at the very beginning of the scene, he says something to Alan Ladd, which is like, "I've got some of my best blood running in your veins." So this is a callback to an earlier scene. Kincaid is injured. They finally like become buddies when they take out an enemy tank together. But in the course of doing so, Alan Ladd gets injured. His leg gets mangled, and they have to perform an emergency amputation. Now, in this scene, there's another character named Bracken who's like the overt racist. Alan Ladd is not a racist; he's just resentful because he's been passed over. But this other character, Bracken, calls Sidney Poitier boy at one point, so it's overtly thematized as a problem. Now, in the scene that's about to follow, that I'm about to show you, Bracken is the person who has to hold the tube through which the blood flows between the two bodies.
It's okay not to be like you know.
Outside. Ikea station is Taylor.
Okay, sir.
You really Jackson and the other coast. Watch out for that heavy equipment. They should be pushing it up soon.
In case you didn't know that his foot's been cut off, that's the boot. So I don't think it's too much to say this is pretty Freudian, this scene. This is a literal castration, or not, it's a symbolic castration that's taken place. The way I read it is this. So Bracken, the white Southerner, he's made not only an intimate witness to this event, but a participant in it as well. And releasing the clamp, he's directly responsible for bringing about the mixing of black and white blood that are his worst nightmare. A miscegenation that even worse results from the coming together of male bodies. In order to help save Kincaid, he must overcome a repugnance that intermingles an above-board racism and a down-low homophobia. And while his face registers disgust and horror throughout the scene, it ultimately expresses a sense of resignation. After the operation, the chastened Bracken finally begins to treat Towler with the respect he's due. So what's interesting to me about this film is it literally stages the unmanning of white men as the sort of necessary price for integration to take place. And the kind of Freudian homoerotic overtones, it speaks to the ways in which the Korean War became a site in which this very familiar canonical architecture comes into place. Robin Wigman has a book called American Anatomies where she talks about the 1950s as a moment when the image of Huck and Jim on the raft becomes enshrined, and you have the emergence of versions of the buddy film. So the notion that the white and black men in Intimacies sort of represent the best of what, the sort of core of what American culture is, it gets invented in the 1950s. And I think one thing that's been left out of the account of how that came into being was the Korean War. Because I think this is, to me, where a lot of this starts. Okay, so that's Intimacies in black and white. I want to turn now to Intimacies in black and yellow. As I mentioned at the outset, the Korean War was the event that solidified Japan's status as the key ally of the United States in East Asia. U.S. foreign policy, as it took shape in the early Cold War years, sought to establish a free trade zone in that region as a bulwark against the spread of communism, one in which Japan would function as the economic linchpin. Japan was also the country in which many of the first U.S. soldiers to enter the fighting were stationed. As historian Bruce Cummings points out, most mainstream Korean War narratives from the United States actually seem to focus more on life in occupied Japan than on the fighting in Korea. In most American memoirs, he writes, quote, "Korea is a never-known nightmare to be escaped to one piece. Japan is civilized, beautiful, with a petite culture only to be admired, not to mention the floor shows, the ginza, the golf courses," end quote. In many of these works, Japan also emerges as the site of fraternization between U.S. servicemen and Japanese civilian women. A number of films focused on these interracial, and international romances, including Sayonara, a Marlon Brando vehicle that came out in 1957, which was based on a novel by James Michener. Brando plays a pilot suffering from battle fatigue whose psychic health is restored by the love of a Japanese woman. Trafficking in the Orientalist myth of the subservient Japanese women, such films worked, according to cultural critic Gina Marchetti, quote, "to shore up a threatened white masculinity in light of American women's growing independence during World War II," end quote. In November 1950, an African-American version of this Orientalist narrative began to emerge on the pages of black newspapers when news broke that 400 black soldiers had applied to the Army for permission to marry Japanese women. The particular allure that Japanese women held for black soldiers was the focus of a front page article that appeared in the November 11th issue of the Chicago Defender that ran under the headline, "Why Tan Yanks Go for Japanese Girls." The story, which proved to be controversial to the newspaper's readership, sought to provide an intimate view of the amorous relationships that members of the 24th Regiment had formed with Japanese women, or as they were called, musumes. Wilson's article is based on interviews with soldiers and with Ethel Payne, who's the director of an Army Service Club, which catered to black servicemen in Yokohama. Wilson admits that while he was initially under the impression that love affairs between the GIs and musumes were of the, quote, passing fancy variety, end quote, he soon became, quote, amazed to find many as deep-rooted or more so than engagements of a strictly racial kind in the United States, end quote. A certain tension exists between the rationale that the article itself offers for the appeal of Japanese women and the visual explanation that's related by the 3 large photographs accompanying it. These pictures are presented as a typology of female beauty, as none of the women's names are actually given. So you've got, in the face of such oriental glamour as displayed by this Japanese girl, any man would weaken. But it's more than sheer beauty that has endeared these girls to the heart of American GIs. And then you have this girl. This 19-year-old Japanese beauty, the girlish type, has become as Americanized in her dress and customs as any to be found in a modern American city. She is engaged to a tan Yank. No census has been taken of the number of Japanese American war babies in Japan, but tots like this one, shown with her mother, is the daughter of a tan Yank. So there's actually 4 females pictured here. And I think when you look at these images, why are tan Yanks drawn to Japanese girls? These pictures suggest because they look like white women. Right? The photos really render Japanese women as fairly white. So there's a tension between the visuals here and the article itself. One thing I want to note about these pictures is nobody's wearing a kimono, right? Nobody's wearing anything that signifies a kind of exotic Japaneseness. But the article itself sort of traffics in the stereotype. So Ethel Payne, who's the director of the Service Club, says, quote, by tradition, the Japanese woman is submissive. To the man of her choice or the one who wins her affection, she presents a convincing superficial respectfulness and affection, end quote. And then another woman at the club says, Thelma Smith says, quote, it is not unusual for the Japanese girl to shut up when ordered to do so and to voluntarily look after every whim of her mate while he is with her, end quote. And then one of the soldiers that's interviewed, Lieutenant Mormon, says that he likes Japanese women because, quote, always you come first in her life, end quote. But as he elaborates further on the submissive femininity of the Japanese woman, this soldier Mormon uses terms that connote a more contemporary ideal of domesticity. The desired Japanese female, he contends, quote, is loyal, devoted, thrifty, and a good homemaker, end quote. This last term is key, for the allure of the musumes is intimately tied to the kind of homes that tan Yanks are able to make with them in Japan. And we get a sense of that from this quote. Before leaving Japan for Korea, a number of doughboys bought neat bungalows and furnished them in the latest style from Sears Roebuck and Montgomery Ward. Other GIs rented Japanese homes and modernized Western style, the interiors. So what this quote suggests, and the other articles sort of speak to this as well, that the Japanese woman is apparently prized not so much because she exemplifies a highly sexualized or dangerous femininity, which is more the stereotype, but because she is an angel of domesticity, mid-century style, a necessary accoutrement of the middle-class lives that black GIs have become accustomed to enjoying in Japan. What black soldiers seem to find there is something like the suburban ideal so dear to the heart of Cold War America, but one largely denied to black men under Jim Crow. The Japanese woman functions then as a symbol of the life that black men will presumably lay claim to in a post-segregated future. She's valued not only for her sexual desirability, but for being the very emblem of a peaceable domesticity. Given that domesticity is available only to white men back home, this explains the sort of virtual whiteness of the photographs. But there's still another level to this depiction, which is articulated by Ethel Payne again. She's trying to explain the attraction And she says, there's the color factor. The hue of the girls ranged from very fair to a nut brown. So there's no nut brown girls pictured, right? But Paine's words suggest this. Hence, it can be easily understood why our boys fall for them. And like what she leaves unsaid is that she's highlighting that they're colored, right? Unlike the photographs. So on the one hand, it seems like the Japanese woman is like this sort of enduring stereotype of the Oriental submissive woman. On the other hand, the Japanese woman is like the white middle-class housewife, right? And then in some ways, she's also like a certain kind of colored woman. And what I want to argue is that ultimately, like, it's not just that there are three images of Japanese women. What's being fetishized is a kind of morphability or malleability. Like what Japanese women, what's so alluring about Japanese women is that they can change, they can morph. And the very end of the article sort of suggests this. During the past 5 years, American soldiers have played a big role in helping to emancipate. Emancipate's an interesting verb there, right? The Japanese girl. Most of them no longer trot along on getas, wooden shoes, and in traditional colorful kimonos. Today, through the love of the men, the girls have learned to walk gracefully in high-heel shoes and to dress with the taste and finesse of American women. Here, too, Sears Roebuck did a thumping business. GIs gasped, it is said, when the musumes junked their kimonos and came out attired in American dress, slacks and jackets, knee-length or thigh-spanking skirts. For the first time, the men were able to admire some of the shapeliest cheesecake in the world, hitherto hidden by bulky kimonos. Okay. Yeah, sorry. It's not my, it's not my fault. The last thing I want to say is, like, all of this has a disciplinary message directed at black women at home. Because what the article ultimately does, it sort of says to black women, if you're worried about losing your men, this is your competition, and you should become more like them. So there's that trajectory. Anyway, this is a sort. I don't want to present this as a representative depiction of Japan in the black press, but it speaks to things that are going on. I think the main thing is that Japan emerges as a kind of weird, like middle class suburbia. In the imagination, which is, I think, a pretty interesting development. Okay, so I do have time for the third thing. Okay, so the third thing that I'd like to talk about, and this part's called Intimacies in Black and Yellow, Part 2, Race War and an American Dream. And I'm actually not going to be able to talk about this memoir very much. But I just want to conclude by suggesting a more radical sensibility that can also be discerned in some African-American depictions of the war, which can be thought of as foreshadowing the one that would develop more fully during the Vietnam War. Daniel Widener asserts that, quote, the unease, anxiety, and opposition generated between 1950 and 1953 produced lasting impressions among a critical swath of black Americans, including several who would play critical roles in the radical era that accompanied the Vietnam War, end quote. Toni Morrison, in a similar vein, has asserted that part of her motivation in writing her novel Home, the protagonist of which is a returning Korean War veteran, was to explore how African Americans' experiences of that conflict and other key events in the 50s became, quote, the seeds that produced the 60s and 70s, end quote. So, I think a lot of times when scholars look to the Korean War, there's this puzzlement, like how come, given the similarities between the Korean War and the Vietnam War, why didn't black descent emerge more fully voiced as it did during the Vietnam War? And what these writers are interested in is like, well, maybe there was a kind of adumbration or foreshadowing of those later sentiments. One figure who helps us see the link between these two wars is Clarence Adams. Clarence Adams was a black, he was from Memphis, and he became a POW very early in the war, and then when the war ended, he was one of 21 US POWs who decided to go to China instead of coming back to the US. So it was like a huge sort of ideological conundrum that came up, that sort of floated around these 21. His memoir is called An American. I don't have time to talk about the memoir, but let me just give you a sense of it. An American Dream. It came out in 2007, and it's a posthumously published memoir, and it's an incredibly fascinating life. So he describes Jim Crow Memphis as a state of perpetual race war. Like the life he describes is like you're always under the threat of being beaten by white cops, and there's a lot of black and white, black on black violence that happens on the streets. Ironically, the part of the memoir set in Memphis is the most violent of the memoir. So then when you get to the war, he doesn't see that much fighting. There's a sense of disillusionment. And he joins the army because he's afraid of getting arrested, not on any patriotic duty. Then when he's in the war, he doesn't see much fighting because he gets captured quickly thereafter. And ironically, when he's forced to march with other POWs to this prison camp, to this march north to this POW camp, that camp, which you might think of in an African-American narrative, would be likened to a slavery plantation. It's actually presented as a site of freedom because in the POW camp, the communists give him access to literacy and education. And his decision to go to China instead of returning to the US is totally framed within the language of opportunity. He learns Chinese, he becomes a translator, works for a publishing company, marries a Chinese woman, has kids, and he ends up enjoying some version of a middle-class life in China. He comes back when the Cultural Revolution takes off, comes back to Memphis with his wife and kids, and opens a chain of Chinese restaurants. So, yeah, it's just an incredible story. But anyway, he became infamous, actually, both in the Korean War, because he was one of the 21, and for a brief moment during the Vietnam War. And this is from an article in the New York Times, which is talking about a message that he gave on radio, Radio Peking, I think. And the Times called him the Vietnam version of Tokyo Rose. So this is from the Times. The message, which the Hanoi radio said had been taped in Peking, begins, "Hi, fellows, let's have a heart-to-heart talk. Adams says he is a veteran of the 502nd Field Artillery of the 2nd Army Division in Korea. Before capture, we had been told that Asians were barbarians, that it was better to go down fighting than to surrender," he continues. "I am the living truth that the American bosses have lied about the Asians in the same way that they've lied about Africans and Latin Americans," he says. "Thanks to our capture, I am now happily married and have 2 lovely children." He tells the GIs that they are fighting the people in Vietnam like the ones I fought in Korea, people who are defending their homes with homemade weapons. The people of Vietnam know what they're fighting for. They know that their enemy is the American big shot. They know that the burning of their homes, schools, towns, and villages is America's doings. Americans will have to get out of Vietnam, and the Vietnamese will see that they do. Referring to the American civil rights struggle, he asks, "Fellows, are you on the right side of this? The Vietnamese are not bombing your churches and killing your children. You're in the wrong battle here," he concludes. "You are fighting the wrong war. Brothers, go home. The Negro people need you back there." Now, if that rhetoric sounds a little bit familiar, it might be because a few years later, in 1967, a much more famous black figure said this: "Why should they ask me to put on a uniform and go 10,000 miles from home and drop bombs and bullets on brown people in Vietnam while so-called Negro people in Louisville are treated like dogs and denied simple human rights? No, I'm not going 10,000 miles from home to help murder and burn another poor nation simply to continue the domination of white slave masters of the darker people the world over." And then this is the version that most people have heard. "Keep asking me no matter how long on the war in Vietnam, I sing this song, I ain't got no quarrel with the Viet Cong." While both Ali and Adams voiced their objection to the wars African-American men have been made to fight in Asia, they do not denounce war in general. It's kind of like Obama, right? Defending just wars, but their pacifism has a specific object, and it depends on the ability to distinguish between just and unjust wars. Ali and Adams describe the unjust war that America is waging in Vietnam, which Adams describes as the repetition of the one that took place in Korea in racial and colonial terms. Ali characterizes the Vietnam War as part of a much longer conflict, one in which white slave masters have engaged in a race war against the darker people the world over. The reason he and other African Americans ain't got no quarrel with the Viet Cong, he suggests, is that brown people of Vietnam and so-called Negro people are seemingly part of the same people. Adams similarly asserts that Vietnam is the wrong war for black GIs because the American bosses have lied about the Asians in the same way that they've lied about Africans and Latin Americans. Linking together what Ollie refers to as the darker people of the world over is, in Adams's view, their shared status as barbarians in the eyes of an imperialist racism that lumps them all together. The war that black GIs should be fighting, Adam tells us, is already raging back home against those who have been bombing your churches and killing your children. So structuring both Adams and Ollie's statements is the metaphor of race war, a militarized view of the domestic conflict between black and white Americans that links it to a long-standing global conflict between the white and non-white races. For them, the Korean War and the Vietnam War were simply the most recent flare-ups in a century-long race war in which white slave masters have sought to dominate the darker people of the world over. So this concept of race war is also at the heart of a political and cultural formation that Bill Mullins has dubbed Afro-Orientalism. Exemplified and inaugurated by W.E.B. Du Bois's writings on the world historical role that Africa and Asia could play in bringing racism, colonialism, and capitalism to an end, Afro-Orientalism, in Mullins' words, comprises a counter-discourse that at times shares with its dominant namesake certain features, but primarily constitutes an independent critical trajectory of thought. It is a signifying discourse on race, nation, and global politics, constituting a sub-tradition in indigenous writing on imperialism, colonialism, and the making of capitalist empire. The Korean War writings of Clarence Adams and Toni Morrison, which I examine at length in my book, are exemplary for the complex ways in which they make their readers aware of the uncomfortable intimacies that link the domestic history of race with the multivalently racial histories of empire. They remind us that while many of us remember that W.E.B. Du Bois ended the second chapter of The Souls of Black Folk with this sentence, "The problem of the 20th century is the problem of the color line," we should also remember that he began that chapter with this sentence: "The problem of the color line is the 20th century is the problem of the color line, the relation of the darker to the lighter races of men in Asia, Africa, and America, and the islands of the sea." For it is the more expansive formulation that speaks to the complexities of race and empire that shaped the Korean War. Thanks.